I think it was a little bit of a surprise, Yvonne. I think people knew and are focused on the fact that there is an election for the president of the LDP party, which is essentially the Prime Minister of Japan, and that election is coming up. But there was, of course, some question as to whether the current Prime Minister would run for that role or not. So his announcement was a little bit of a surprise.
What do you make of the timing of the announcement?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. He was actually due to travel to Central Asia as part of some visits that were planned. But the announcement that Japan was facing this threat of a mega quake meant that the Prime Minister cancelled that. So perhaps, I mean, it's conjecture, I guess, but maybe he just took this time, which is quite unusual, really, given that it's a week holiday for most of Japan. We had a long weekend and then there's this sort of series of holidays. So, I think the timing was unusual, but he probably had plenty of time to think of it, given what has transgressed in the last little while.
Well, what has happened in recent months? How has Fumio Kishida's popularity waned? What do you think has contributed to this?
Look, he's a strong player in terms of foreign policy, and that's what a lot of your audience will know. Today our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese commented on Twitter what a good friend Prime Minister Kishida was to Australia in terms of strengthening the Australia-Japan relations. Likewise, the same can be said for the continuing strengthening of the US-Japan relations, and likewise South Korea. So he's very well known for being a strong performer in terms of foreign policy. But back home, I guess there was some question as to how the LDP was going to handle the two scandals that have sort of plagued the party for the last 2 or 3 years. And namely, those scandals are the Unification Church issue and, of course, some of the political donation scandals that sort of have just gone on for a long time, and I think has made the whole sort of populace quite weary in recent times.
What can Mr Kishida be credited with achieving during his tenure, particularly where the economy is concerned?
Look, I think in his press conference that he gave this morning, he was very clear about where he felt he should take responsibility for some of those issues. But I think he also made reference, and rightly so, to the changes that he's been able to make to Japanese energy policy. He spoke about the green transformation, or GX as it's known in Japan, and his role in pushing Japan's decarbonisation. He also spoke a little bit about the defence policy changes that had taken place. And of course, we all know that he was responsible for the appointment of Mr Ueda, who is the governor of the Bank of Japan, and that's brought about some change in Japan too. So I think history will look back on Kishida's time as Prime Minister differently to what those polls reflect now, and hopefully people will get a balance between both that domestic and the foreign story.
Well, Mr Kishida says the LDP needs a fresh start. Apart from a new leader, what other changes do you think voters would want to see?
Look, I think the Japanese population wants stability in many cases. I don't think they want to see a great radical shift from what has been really steady rule in the last decades. But of course, I think they're open and they want to know that there's continued focus on the Japanese economic sort of recovery. And that people's wages continue to increase, which they haven't done for a very long time until Kishida pushed very hard for those. So there are a lot of things I think that the population is looking for in terms of its domestic focus. And I think this race for the LDP Prime Minister and who will take the reins will be quite an interesting discussion for many political commentators over the next few weeks.
And who do you think might take over his role?
It's quite a large group of people who are bidding or who will put their hand in for this position, including 2 women. One woman is the current foreign minister and is regarded quite highly, as is another woman contender. So it's an interesting time. As you say, the Prime Minister called for a reform-minded successor and somebody who can take Japan to the next stage. So there'll be a very, very busy time. Not only are we dealing with typhoons that are imminent, and potentially this horrible quake that is sort of hanging over our heads, but now we've got a very, very busy political time in Japan too.
Well, with the elections due next year, there'll be a lot of preparation going on for that. How formidable do you think the main opposition party is?
Look, that's, the Japanese opposition parties are doing everything they possibly can to be a credible source of opposition to the government. But, their numbers are quite low in terms of where they can make a change. They are also expecting to announce their own new leaders. In fact, the coalition party of the LDP, the Komeito, it has got its own elections coming up, as does the CDP, which is the sort of other major opposition party. So, with three parties all changing leadership in the next little while, it makes for a great deal of change. But as I say, people will be looking for stability, but potentially a new phase to face some of these issues that Japan has to face.
Melanie, always great to get your views. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Pleasure. Thank you.